Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. In my never-ending quest to stretch the boundaries of this channel and to give you all sorts of different content, I'm going to do a video today which is about a classic comedy series. It's something I'd like to do, a run of videos about some of my own personal favourite comedy series over the years. Now I know that's not the sort of stuff I normally do here. It's normally science fiction and fantasy and genre stuff, classics, retrospectives and so on. But I just thought it might be nice to spread my wings a little bit and talk about something outside those particular genres. And I do like a comedy. I like a good sitcom. I like an old-fashioned classic British sitcom. We don't get many of them these days, which is a shame. But today I'm going to talk about one of my favourite classic comedy series from days gone by. And there's a lot to choose from. But I rewatched a classic show recently. It's Fawlty Towers, as you probably gathered from the thumbnail. And I've seen Fawlty Towers many times, but I think watching it now, I'm suddenly appreciating just how damn good it is and how well structured and how well put together. So join me now as we take a trip to Torquay and meet up with Basil, Sybil and the gang at Fawlty Towers. Hello, welcome back. My name is Paul Mount. Yes, it's the first of my hopefully new series, depending on how this one does, looking at some classic British sitcoms. There's a bit of background. I grew up in the 60s and 70s watching a slew of British sitcoms. And these were the days when there were probably about 5 really good quality sitcoms in the schedules every week. Returning series like Dad's Army, Steptoe and even things like Till Death Us Do Part, which I probably wasn't really supposed to be watching, but I watched it anyway. Then we'd have later things like The Liver Birds, Rising Damp, George and Mildred. The list goes on and on. And I like those sorts of comedies. There's a massive nostalgia fix with those shows because we don't get many of them these days. Comedies these days are much more sophisticated than they used to be, and they're aimed at, sadly, a smaller market. You don't get many of the traditional multi-camera studio sitcoms, which are what most of the shows I'll be talking about in this series, if it goes to a series, were. They were filmed in the studios, BBC Television Centre studios, or whichever studios ITV used around the regions to record their shows, in front of a live studio audience. I think at the moment, there's 2 of those sorts of shows that still exist on British television, and that's Not Going Out, the apparently endless Lee Mack comedy series, which has changed so much over the years that it's virtually unrecognisable for what it was. But it's still made in that same way. It's still made as almost like a live theatre production, although obviously there are edits and breaks and so on. But it's all done in front of a specially brought in studio audience. And Mrs. Brown's Boys. We'll say no more about that, shall we? Needless to say, I won't be doing a video about Mrs. Brown's Boys anytime soon. And I think that when Dave made the last couple of Red Dwarf specials, they apparently were also done in front of a live studio audience in the way that the original BBC series were for some time. We don't get that anymore. I don't know why it is. That's just fallen out of favour. And comedy, certainly in the 21st century, has become more cinematic, I suppose, in the way it's made. It's now made single camera, usually on film on location. And I think this all started really, in a way, with Ricky Gervais's Office, which dispensed with the idea of an audience. And that's the way that comedies are made these days. I think that the last great British comedy series is Gavin and Stacey, which finished with its enormous Christmas special last year, which had 21 million viewers. And that wasn't a studio sitcom. That was all done on location. And they don't have a studio audience. There's no laughter track. And I used to quite like the live audience or laughter track, not because you need to be told when something's funny, but it does create a sort of a sense of shared experience. You're laughing at something in the same way that the audience is laughing. I think that classic shows like Only Fools and Horses wouldn't be half as funny without the reaction of the audience, the hysterical reaction of the audience. And I'm thinking of 2 specific instances in that show. The famous chandelier moment, and of course Del Boy falling through the bar, endlessly repeated on compilation shows. But it's the hysterical audience reaction that makes those scenes so funny. They're funny in themselves and inherently, but I think hearing the audience laughter just makes you laugh even more. And I think that's where so many modern comedies are missing something. I mean, okay, you can argue that that sort of production is unsophisticated, and I think when you look at something like Not Going Out, certainly in the most recent series, it looks like something from a different age, but that's the whole issue about that particular series. If you're of an age like me and you grew up in the 60s and 70s when comedies all had laughter tracks, and I keep calling them laughter tracks, but they are studio audience laughter, and I know that there was very often beefed up in the edit if the laughter wasn't quite as big enough, so they call it a laughter track. But this is, shows that are done in front of a live studio audience. Some of the American shows, the best American shows, had live audiences. Thinking of Friends, Big Bang Theory, the original Frasier, even when Frasier came back recently for its sadly unsuccessful relaunch, it had a live studio audience. It just adds to the feel of a comedy. I think if you're laughing at something, you want to laugh with people. But that's just me. A lot of people don't feel like that these days. A lot of people like comedies that are slick and filmic and invite you to laugh in your own way rather than being told to laugh. And there have been some good comedies over the last few years which I have enjoyed. Things like Friday Night Dinner and Gavin and Stacey and a few odds and sods here and there. But I feel that comedies these days are a bit intense and a bit earnest, and they seem to be dominated by issues and so on. I'm not going to use the W word, but you know what I mean. Sometimes you just want to laugh at something that's funny for the hell of it. And having watched this particular series of Fawlty Towers, the two series over the last few weeks, I appreciated Fawlty Towers far more than I ever have. And I've seen it so many times. It's a show which has been endlessly repeated by the BBC. They brought it out on video. They brought it out on DVD. They brought it out on record back in the day. It's now been released on Blu-ray. It looks very nice on Blu-ray. And I recently rewatched all 12 episodes of Fawlty Towers because, of course, there were only 12 episodes. A lot of people still don't seem to realise that. They seem to think it ran for years and years. But there were two series. And there was a huge gap in between those series for creative reasons about the writing and creation of the show. And I watched it recently because I had the Blu-ray version. And I watched an episode across 2 weeks, usually sort of just before I went to bed, because it was a nice relaxer, a nice unwinder to watch something which is pure farce, pure old school, old-fashioned studio-based comedy. And I have that connection to that sort of TV production. But watching those 12 episodes again now, and I think I watched them with a different eye this time. I watched them in the past and had a laugh at them and thought, God, Basil, what are you up to? Sybil, oh, she's a right old witch. And all the other characters, oh, Manuel. And you laugh at all that because it's funny. But watching it now, I think I had a different eye on it, as I said. I think I appreciated far more the absolute artistry of it and the sophisticated way it was written and produced. Now, it's easy to look at it and think, oh, the walls wobble a lot when Basil's hitting them and everything shakes. And it's a flimsy studio set in Television Centre. And because Basil Fawlty's character, played, of course, by John Cleese, is so physical, he's running up and down the stairs and he's banging on windows that are made of plastic and tapping walls and doing things. So the sets inevitably have a wobble to them because they're not made for that sort of treatment. But that doesn't matter, because when you watch it now, certainly when I watched it now, I really finally understood what John Cleese always said. The problem with writing the show and why it took so long is because it is so beautifully constructed, so beautifully put together, so well crafted. And you do get the feeling that every line of dialogue was a labour of love, and every scene and every character was agonised over, because it is classic British farce in a 1970s style, updating the whole idea of farces that were so popular. Things like the Whitehall farces with Brian Ricks. I think all that sort of stuff has long since faded. People running in and out of rooms and running up and down stairs, and misunderstandings and misidentification, all that sort of stuff. That's all in Fawlty Towers, but in a much more cleverly written way, rather than just the oops, my trousers have fallen down, which I think tended to be the general theme of the Whitehall farces. It is a superbly put together series in so many ways. The casting is spot on, all the stories, and they are stories. They are actually narratives. They're not just gags and jokes. They really are situation and comedy. It's a story that carries on and develops throughout the episode, reaching a crescendo when things become more and more cringy and more embarrassing as Basil puts himself in more and more ridiculous situations that he could easily have extricated himself from far earlier. And I know that this is something that Ben Elton, who has written a lot of comedies over the years, he's always said, and he did with Blackadder, you had to have a plot, you had to have a story to drive things forward. Otherwise, it's just people cracking jokes all the time. And I think that's what I think has happened, certainly with Not Going Out. It's about making jokes with quite a flimsy story supporting it. The origins of Fawlty Towers, of course, are very well known. Back in the late 60s, the Monty Python crew had decanted down to Torquay in Devon for a batch of location filming sequences. And they stayed in the Glen Eagles Hotel, which was run by the eccentric owner Donald Sinclair. John Cleese noticed that Donald Sinclair was a very rude and abrasive man who didn't seem to enjoy running a hotel. He was rude to the guests. He was stuffy. He was snobbish. The guests were a hindrance to him. I think one of the waitresses who worked for him once stated that it was as if he didn't want the guests to be there. And that's very much what you get from Basil. And that was the inspiration for that character. But that character didn't lead directly to Basil Fawlty, because there was a version of that character who appeared in an early 1970s episode of the long-running LWT comedy Doctor in the House, based on the books by Richard Gordon, which had inspired a film series back in the 50s and 60s. John Cleese was an occasional writer for that series, along with Graham Chapman, and there was one particular episode called No Ill Feelings, where the lead doctor in that particular series, played by the late Barry Evans, checks into a hotel in a small town, but his very presence there seems to wind up the aggressive and incompetent manager of the hotel, who has a domineering wife. It was actually shown in May 1971, and that aggressive and rude hotel manager was played by actor Timothy Bateson. Clearly, in writing that episode, Cleese thought that there was really a lot more comic mileage to be drawn from the idea of this character, and he and his then wife, Connie Booth, set about creating the idea of Fawlty Towers and putting it all together, crafting the scripts for the first 6 episodes. But the show didn't have an easy ride to BBC television. I think one of the BBC comedy commissioners felt that it was desperately unfunny, the jokes weren't funny, the setting wasn't funny, it wasn't going to work. However, the series was commissioned and it debuted on British television on the 24th of October 1975 for its first 6-episode run. It wasn't particularly well regarded at the time. Critic Richard Ingrams took a particular dig at it, which is why in a series 2 episode there's a character called Mr. Ingrams who's caught in flagrante delicto blowing up a pleasure doll in his bedroom. But the series quickly establishes its format in its very first episode, Touch of Class, where we see that Basil is a complete snob. He derides and decries the quality of guests they have in the hotel, but when a posh upper-class gentleman, played by Michael Gwynn, turns up in the hotel, he's all over him. He's falling all over him. He can't do enough for him. He lends him money. He bends over backwards to do everything he can because he thinks that this is the sort of guest Fawlty Towers should be attracting. Of course, Michael Gwynn's character turns out to be a charlatan and a con man, and Basil, let's just say, he gets his revenge. This sets up the idea of the whole series, really. Basil is a man who runs this hotel in a beautiful part of the country. He wants to be a bit more upper class than he actually is. Constant thorn in his side is his waspish wife, Sybil, played with an impressive beehive hairdo by Prunella Scales. She is a superb foil to Basil because she's calm and measured and collected, whereas Basil flies off the handle at a moment's notice, overreacts, misinterprets, misunderstands, and completely gets the wrong end of the stick. And very often it's Sybil who comes along and tries to put things right, tries to put Basil in his place. She's got the upper hand in the relationship, and you do wonder how and why these two, who don't seem to get on very well, have stuck together for 15 years, let alone how they run a hotel for 15 years. Also in the cast, we've got Cleese's then wife, Connie Booth, as Polly Sherman. She's a bright and breezy and attractive waitress who's also a part-time artist. She's trying to make it in the art world. And that's a little thread that runs throughout the series. She often gets drawn into Basil's schemes and plans, often against her will. She tries to calm him down, but as ever, she gets drawn in and pulled into the bizarre situations that Basil creates for himself. And of course, we've got Manuel, played by the late Andrew Sachs. He's from Barcelona. Character they probably wouldn't be allowed to do today because it would be considered to be a racial stereotype of this eager to please, cowering, slightly dim Spanish waiter who can't speak English, gets frequently bashed about the head by Basil, gets exasperated with him, and is basically treated as a second-class citizen. But John Cleese is the star of the show. He plays the tall, gangly, frantic Basil. Probably today he would be diagnosed as autistic or having ADHD, but he frequently makes the wrong call when situations arise. He won't put the lid on things by owning up to a mistake he's made or owning up to something that's gone wrong. He will try to cover things up, and in covering things up and drawing other people into his web of lies, things just get worse and worse, and the situation spirals out of control. It's what some people might call cringe comedy, because it can be quite odd and hard to watch, because you watch these episodes and no matter how many times you've watched them, you say to yourself, why have you done that, Basil? If you'd just done something else, or if you just said this, the whole situation would have been diffused. But of course, that's the whole point of the comedy. He doesn't do these things. He does the wrong thing. He makes the wrong decisions. He makes the wrong call. And he ends up in a massive amount of trouble. He tries to save face by blaming other people. He tries to laugh things off. But of course, it just always backfires, because that's what the situations are all about. And that's what I mean by the episodes being so well crafted, because they're so multi-layered. There's very often 2 or 3 little storylines bubbling away, and a lot of things planted at the beginnings of episodes that bear fruit a bit later on. There's even a reference in one episode to Manuel's pet hamster. And as we all know, that raises its head, literally, in the very last episode, Basil the Rat. Now, as I mentioned, the first series aired in 1975, ran for 6 weeks, and eventually it picked up a lot of momentum. And by the time it had finished, people were realizing that this was actually a bit of a classic comedy in the way it was put together and the way it dealt with what were quite familiar and might appear to be lazy, farcical, stereotypical situations. So obviously a second series was required, but it was such hard work writing the scripts. It's hard to imagine now that it took John Cleese and Connie Booth, who by now were divorced but still friendly, took them about 2 to 3 years to write 6 scripts. The reason for that is that they were so forensic in their construction of these episodes. Every line had to matter. Every scene had to mean something and move the story forward. Every character had to have a purpose. And I've also read a quote from John Cleese where he said that once they were filmed, they spent weeks in the editing suite, making the episodes as tight as they could be, cutting out lines here, cutting out characters here, cutting out scenes if they made the series or the episode feel a bit flabby, which I think accounts for the fact that there's an inconsistent running time to the series. Some episodes are the traditional half an hour, some are 31 minutes, a couple of 35 minutes, some are odd. There's no set length for the episodes because they very much depended on how they were edited and what it was felt was the optimum length for the episodes. The show returned for its second series in October 1979. This was 4 years exactly from the start of the series. And the 6th and final episode, Basil the Rat, was in fact delayed by the bedevilment of the BBC in the 70s, industrial action, so it was screened some months later. I really enjoyed watching the series again. I'm not going to go into great detail about the storylines because I know that you will have seen it like me so many times, but watching it now for the first time in years, as I said, the main thing I took away from it was how beautifully constructed and beautifully written it is, and how clever the dialogue is, and how smart the characterizations are. And even in between all the jokes and the gags, there's nice little character things, dialogue things that make the people seem real, that aren't necessarily humorous. They are just a line of dialogue here and there, which are people just conversing with one another. It's not about the gags, it's about making the characters believable, and then it makes the comic situations more believable. There's all these supporting characters as well. The brilliant Ballard Barkley playing the Major. I was watching his performance in particular because he's very much of the old school, almost like a music hall performer. He reacts with lots of, and when two other people are doing things, he's expressing himself with his body and his face in ways that are not necessarily televisual. They are much more theatrical. But he adds to it because it makes the character who's very old-fashioned and very set in his ways and probably has dementia by today's standards. But he makes him more comedic by the way he reacts to Basil, who is so patient with him. He regards him as an old fool, but he is very patient with him because he is one of the hotel's long-standing residents. It's a great performance from Ballard Barkley, and I'd not really taken it in before just how good he is in the role. And there are lots of other performances. In the second series, we get Brian Hall, who plays Terry, who's the new chef. He is a slight outlier because he's completely normal. He's just this Londoner. He's a Cockney guy he appears in most episodes, but he is a voice of reason, really. He hasn't got a comic side to him. He's very much just a foil for some of the comic stuff that's going on courtesy of Basil, Sybil and so on. I think it's just a great series. The performances are all superb. I keep going on about how good the scripts are, but they were so well tooled, and you can't imagine that anybody writing comedy today is writing with this sort of dedication and absolute sense of craft to every aspect of the show. If, as a fan of Fawlty Towers, you think, I must get down to Torquay and have a look at some of the locations, you'll be wasting your time, because the show, although it was set in Torquay, never went anywhere near the town. The location of Fawlty Towers itself was actually the Woburn Grange Country Club in Woburn Green in Buckinghamshire. It's a fine old building, and I'm actually surprised that when they filmed in 75 it was still in the same condition in 79. That unfortunately no longer exists. It burnt down in 1991. After Fawlty Towers ended, it became a restaurant called Basil's. I think it became a nightclub for a while, and there are some rumours that it fell into disrepute towards the end of its life, and its destruction was something of an insurance job. So the building unfortunately was demolished after the fire in 1991, has now been replaced by a brand new housing estate. There's literally now no sign of anything that would be recognisable from Fawlty Towers. But what's interesting about watching the episodes again, it's Fawlty Towers and there's a sign above the doorway saying Fawlty Towers, but there are a few scenes when you see a reverse angle of the metal sign for the Woburn Grange Country Club, as I think there's a laundry van driving out of the hotel grounds in one scene. There's a couple of scenes where you see the reverse of the Woburn Grange Country Club sign. It's quite clearly that's what it's saying. It is quite odd they didn't cover that up. There's no real explanation for why they didn't do that. They could have done quite happily, but they just left it as the actual location where it was. And all the rest of the location stuff, none of it was done in Torquay. Even the famous Basil thrashing his car sequence was done near London. It was all done in that area. It is just a masterpiece. It's as simple as that. It is a show which can be endlessly rewatched. And as I said, I watched the 12 episodes over the last 2 or so weeks. And it was a nice warm end to the day because I was enjoying something I was familiar with, seeing new things in it. And it is one of those shows, and I've said this before about comedy series, you feel as if you know and like the characters, even though none of them are particularly likable, really. You feel that you do like them, and you understand their lives, and you sympathise with them, and you enjoy being in their company. And when the episodes end, you feel a bit bereft. I always felt like that about things like Friday Night Dinner and Gavin and Stacey. It has a warm, familial feel to it. And the Fawlty Towers cast all feel like family in a way. And I felt a little bit sort of empty actually when I finished the last episode because there were no more. I'd watched the 12 over 2 weeks. It felt a bit sad that there were no more. But I can understand why it took them so long to put these 2 series together. It was exhausting. And I suppose there's always the risk that if they'd done a 3rd series, you would have had the not as good as it was thing, which often happens with British comedy shows, which is why so many of the great British comedy shows do up sticks after 2 or 3 series, because they don't want to run themselves into the ground, especially if they're not run-of-the-mill comedies. If they are special comedies that people care a lot about, the makers very often say, well, we quit while we're ahead. And I can see the sense in that. Sometimes you feel it's a bit selfish because you're enjoying the series. You want to spend more time with these characters. But you can understand the makers don't want to risk damaging what they've created by doing inferior episodes, inferior series. So, whilst it's a shame there are only 12 episodes, I think it's also a very good thing. Fawlty Towers is a masterpiece and you really need to see it. I can't imagine there's many people here who haven't seen it because it's been repeated so often. It is part of British 20th century culture. And now, thanks to the stage play in London, it's part of 21st century culture. I was a bit wary when I heard that John Cleese was going to resurrect it for the stage because I thought it's of its time. Will it work? Apparently it's fantastic. It's got a great new cast. I haven't seen it yet. I would like to pop up to London to see it. However, I've discovered that it's actually been filmed and is going to be screened by UK Gold in September. So you can save yourself a train fare. As a side issue again, John Cleese mentioned a couple of years ago that he and his daughter were working on a new Fawlty Towers sequel series that will be set now, which would have Basil, now obviously a little bit older, trying to run a hotel in the Caribbean with his daughter, his long-lost daughter. Nothing much has been heard of that since 2023. So I would just send out a message telepathically, because I don't think John Cleese watches this channel. Don't do it, John. Don't do it. Don't sully what you created and laboured and sweated over back in the 70s by doing something like that, because it sounds like crap, frankly. So anyway, that's Fawlty Towers. That's the first of my comedy retrospectives. I'm going to give Fawlty Towers 10 out of 10 because it is genius. Absolutely genius in so many ways. Not just in being a comedy, but the whole structure of the episodes and the plots and the way everything dovetails and the characters bounce off one another. Superb. They don't make them like that anymore. That's available. I think it's on iPlayer, and you can pick it up on DVD and the new Blu-ray, which came out a couple of years ago. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this first comedy retrospective. Hopefully, if it's gone down well, there will be more to come. There's loads of classic shows I would really like to cover. I've got one or two in mind to do, but that depends on how this one does. Right, thank you for watching. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.